Who should we start with? Okay, so first side note is I can't read out the wonderful bios of all these people because the entire webinar would be that. And so just first of all, we'll just like to introduce you what they're currently doing, and then we'll dig into all of our questions. Okay, so John Lawrence Rivera is the founding artistic director of Playwrights Arena. Give us a wave, John. There you go. Oh, and he turned it up.
Close. It was like.
Jully Lee is a multidisciplinary theatre artist as an actor, director, and artistic director of Cold Tofu. Welcome, Jully.
Thank you.
Leslie Ishii is the artistic director of Perseverance Theatre and board president of the Consortium of Asian American Theatres and Artists. And Snehal Desai is the producing artistic director of East West Players. Hi, Snehal. Wonderful. All right. Well, thank you so much for joining us. So we're going to start. Maybe we'll start with Leslie, and we'll go around table wherever we want to. I'd like to talk a little bit about. We have a global audience here, and we want to talk a little bit about representation in the arts from an Asian American and Pacific Islander perspective. But let's start with what's the landscape of representation from your perspective?
Oh my gosh, that's, my brain goes into all different prongs and layers. The landscape of representation is interesting. I've been in the field a while, and I might toss the ball to John next too, because we've seen decades now, a couple of good decades of. I started at Northwest Asian American Theater in Seattle when there weren't too many Asian American theaters yet. It was before that called the Exclusionary Act, which was a reflection of actual exclusionary legislation in our history as Asians throughout the Northwest in a U.S. context here. So we've watched it where we had to start our own because we weren't included. And Snehal, you'll speak to this for the history of East West Players too. All the way to fighting for representation, fighting for getting our voices heard in the mainstream. I was also in an organization called Media Action Network for Asian Americans, where the founder, at the time the president, I got named the vice president because I think I was just the other interested person at the time, and we slowly built the group. But we would go and work in basically letting Hollywood know when there were stereotypes, when they appropriated culture. And that kind of hand slapping started to bring about more interest in the need for representation. We had a slogan called, it was something like representation actually pays. It's actually more profitable, more successful to give accurate representation. And Guy Aoki was the founder. And because he already worked in the industry, he knew how to hold a press conference. Mm-hmm. So while many of us come from activism where we wanted hundreds or thousands of people to march, he knew how to hold a press conference and get the word out with a number of us representing in the communities of Native, Indigenous, Black, Latinx throughout Los Angeles. And we just started to really blast that way. And that started to resonate because there were a lot of theater artists that were a part of that movement because being in Los Angeles, we worked in both industries, right? And now they cross over readily, quite often. So most people don't know that history. And East West Players was right at the heart of that movement as well, because a number of us worked in and out of East West Players. And that started to spread throughout the nation. The other part I'll just say quickly too is that the Consortium of Asian American Theaters and Artists was started through a group of people, Tim Dang, who was the third artistic director at East West, started to visit each of the Asian American theaters throughout the U.S. and bring those leaders together. It was a kind of a real important conversation. They call it the White Oak Conversation that happened at that location, where they came together and decided to work together. Really, we would say now in activist terms, in coalition. And that began the Consortium of Asian American Theaters and Arts, where we would come together nationally and start to be a force. So that's just a little history, if that helps. Yeah, build some context. But I'll toss the ball. I just mentioned East West Players. John, you've been in the field a long time, and Jully, you've been in there too. We all know each other.
Well, I mean, I just think that the representation in general is abysmal as far as Asian American, representation. I don't think, when you look at statistics, and I know Snehal has it like, in his head all the time, the statistics, because we, whenever there are like, nationally it's bad, but on Broadway itself, it's really horrible. Like when you look at the list of like how many Asians are actors that are actually in Broadway productions, how many directors who are Asian Americans on Broadway. I mean, it's like just almost zero, right? So it's it might feel for us as a group that is alive and thriving, because we are all generating that kind of work. And so when we're creating that work, and you go into East West Players, you go to Perseverance, when you go to Cold Tofu, you go to Playwrights Arena, you feel like this is the norm, but it's not the norm. We make it the norm because it's in our DNA to present, BIPOC artists and Asian and BIPOC narratives. But overall, when you step away from these institutions, all of a sudden you look at like, oh, maybe there's like 2 token BIPOC artists, and it's not even Asian. So you don't really get to see that in the general scheme of things. And I think we need to really figure out how to help our allies, our white American colleagues, theaters that are trying to figure this one out, because it will require an awful lot of work and commitment to make that happen. And Leslie's and Snehal's and Jully's work and our work throughout all of this is not going to be enough until somebody says, just like in alcoholics, they have to say there is a problem and I need to fix this. But sometimes they say, I know there's a problem, I might be able to fix it a little bit. But when you do that, you don't actually fix anything. You have to make those commitments. So that's where I wanted to start off with that conversation. And I know Snehal and Jully, have other, thoughts to say as well.
I have to say, being a theater artist in Los Angeles, I'm part of that small insular group where I see representation of me pretty often, and of my communities, here and there. But yeah, when you see the statistics, it's like, oh my gosh, we're totally invisible. Like I had no idea, because I see me, in the mirror, I see me and my community. For me personally, like from my perspective, and obviously I have a very my own perspective, my own lens on things. It felt like the ball was just starting to roll. There was a Korean American play that was going to open at the Geffen, which is a regional theater in Los Angeles. There was a Lauren Yee's Cambodian rock band who was having multiple shows across the nation. Viet Gone was having multiple productions. And it felt like when COVID happened, it shut everything down. It just felt like the ball was just about to get rolling on like bigger platforms. It's not just these community theaters that are telling our stories. We were having more representation, I guess, on that, strata. But,
Yeah, I just want to echo what everyone's saying. But speaking of statistics,
tell us.
I think right now the statistic I keep talking about is 42% of Americans cannot name an Asian American. So we are largely invisible,
yes,
as nationally as a people, right? So we are largely invisible, and I would say we have been largely quiet for a long time. But that is what is changing. We are no longer quiet. We are no longer sitting by. But I think, people just don't know us. It's 42% can't name anyone, and then it's Jackie Chan, and then it's Bruce Lee. So that's what people can name when you say name an Asian American. And I think it starts, here in Southern California, in Los Angeles, in LAUSD, we're not really a part of the curriculum, right? Mm-hmm. Our history isn't taught. We just aren't incorporated into the narrative of this country. And until that happens, until it's clear that we have roots and we are a part of this, both a sense of belonging for us is going to be, a constant struggle, but also folks are just going to render us outsiders. And then the other big thing is I think we have to combat the monolith, right? Because the other thing is right now everyone is we're lucky when a theater programs an Asian American play one slot a year, but that is really what play, it's a Chinese American play, but what about the South Asian stories or the Korean American stories, right? Like they really tend to box us, and diminish us more and more in different ways. And I think the other way for us is to break apart that monolith so that we are a community as a whole, but there are so many different stories to tell within our community, and so many different experiences. Leslie's family has been here for generations, right? And the Japanese American experience for 6, right?
Yeah.
Whereas my family immigrated here, and I'm the first one born. So I think the length of time and the histories are so different, and the journeys. And I think our artists are there and are telling those stories. They just have not been necessarily picked up. And there's still a lot of gatekeepers who are kind of hesitant to that. But John is wonderful about calling them out with every season. And I think the other thing that is different in this day and age is that theater is a local art form, right? It's a live art form. But now with technology, we're able to nationally support each other. And nationally support and also look at the statistics, not only in our little areas, but regionally and in other ways. And I think when we do that, when we look at the numbers, it's stark.
Mm-hmm. Snehal, I want to lift up APAC, the Asian American Performers Action Coalition.
Yes.
They're a group in New York, right? And they every 2 years or every 3 years, they will go through and actually do the research to give back, to reflect back the representation of New York. And that tends to reflect kind of be very consistent throughout the U.S. as well. And they've been doing this for years now. Every time they do, and I'm going, they lift up that our visibility is either decreased or it hasn't changed. And you should know that it's just a sliver. The percentage of our representation is just a sliver of the larger representation on stages. So they're also this year lifting up the fact that, and really amplifying the fact that with that is the funding. They've looked into historical funding. We're historically underfunded. And so how are we supposed to grow? It's like keeping people in poverty, right? When the majority goes to larger, predominantly white institutions, the majority of the funding. So it keeps everybody able to thrive. And we don't have the subsidies that a lot of other countries have for the arts, So it's a real testament that we're still here and we're fighting for it and we're, working at it. It's a justice issue. It's not, it'd be nice to have this kind of entertainment. This is a real social justice issue.
I think it's really interesting because statistics tend to debunk any people's perception of the situation. And like you just articulated collectively, when you're in your own environment and you're surrounded by your own, putting your own representation out there, you forget how small that statistically is. And statistics has a great way of just highlighting that. Like you said, if it's going up or it's going down, even by a small representation, you know that there's no great strides occurring. I kind of want to ask, do those, you mentioned, John, that people are not directing on Broadway, et cetera, are those people not getting the opportunities and they exist, or is there not a pipeline for people to reach that position?
Wow, that's an interesting question. I think the issue has been about really accessibility and the opportunity that are given to Asian Americans and BIPOC artists. I think it is just inherent in the way that the system is that, that they gravitate to, most of their white colleagues to be pulled into a production. And for most of us, and I know this group of people with us right now, we always have to work 3 times harder than everybody else, and yet it is not recognized because it's because there's somebody who just comes in and knew somebody that was a friend of the director, and all of a sudden they're in that production, and for us it really takes a long time for for people to even recognize the work that we've been doing. And for us in Los Angeles, we're so far away from New York that, you know, I mean, even for me personally as a director, I don't really look into like, oh, I can't wait to do my Broadway production. I'm just trying to do the work that I can do right now here in my space. And just because I don't think that you know, that there is going to be that sudden phone call from, you know, from any of those theaters to say, come and direct this play, because, you know, we are not in their circle of thought. And that's until the leadership in those organizations change, and until there are BIPOC and Asian American leaders in those institutions, you know, the idea of trying to uplift and bring in people of color into a position of power, it's really hard. You know, it's really very hard. And you know, there's got to be a change. And I know things are changing very slightly, but you know, until there are leadership in those organizations, it's really hard to make that happen. Leslie, do you have any?
Yeah, I'll be upfront. I don't talk about this a lot because it was an interesting time, but I'm actually a Broadway vet. I was in Shogun the musical, and I wrote my master's thesis on it because it was so fraught. It was something important. I think it was just my own process to write about it. How here's a theater piece going up on Broadway. The way they even auditioned us was through a very white lens, a white gaze. It was a white director, Michael Snehal, who used to run the San Francisco Ballet, but at that time had won a Tony for reviving Sophisticated Ladies. So here, Michael Snehal was directing almost, I believe everybody except the fight master from Japan was white. A white person wrote the script. So here we all are. To your point, John, what about the environment that we're working in? We had to work through basically a white supremacist culture to try to be and portray this Japanese story that was written by James Clavell, who was white. So, you know, those are the opportunities we get. So I'll be really upfront. Some of us don't care about working there. It's too injurious to work in a white supremacist culture. You incur so much injury that it's like, and I'll be honest too, I think as this country becomes more and more majority people of color, Black, Indigenous people of color, theater is decentralizing. New York has been the pinnacle, and certainly a lot of good work goes on in New York. So it does in LA and Alaska and the Midwest, the Twin Cities, Texas, you know, Florida, everywhere. Good theater work goes on. So in a way, this country, I think, has been decentralizing theater from New York. Again, kudos to our colleagues there, but it's not the end all be all. And as we become more global majority people here in the U.S., I think we find where we make theater with our communities, and as we turn funders around to understand how under-resourced they've been, how racist it's been, and we start to hopefully, we're just starting to see a shift in getting more funding as they recognize that. There's brilliant theater that's been going on forever, not just in New York. Yeah.
Good. Snehal, are you still with us? We can't see you. I can't see you. Can everybody see him?
Yeah, we can see. I can see him.
Oh, I can't see him on my screen. For some reason, he's gone black, but he's still there.
Oh,
yeah.
Sorry about that.
Okay, maybe it's just me.
Oh, sorry.
No, not yet.
No.
Maybe it's just me. Great. So, on the back of that, then that's such a mountain, right? So, where's the way forward? I think you guys are doing the work, right? So you're doing the work, and there's not much more than that can be done. But people are outside this community or looking in or listening to this webinar. What's there to be done? Do we talk about it? Do we share it? Do we go and see your works? What's the pathway to support that greater representation? Maybe we'll go with Snehal.
Well, I
can't see him, but hopefully I will soon.
You can hear me okay, right?
Yes.
Okay. So I think there's two interesting things. One is also a reassessment of the.
I can't. Is he speaking? Because I can't hear him.
Yeah, we can
Yes.
hear. Yeah, we can hear him.
Okay. I can't hear him.
One is a reassessment of the candidate.
Maybe I'll just try and refresh for me. Okay, so we'll let him speak.
Maybe I'll pass it to someone else.
No, no. Hold on.
Reassessment, Snehal. Yeah.
Okay. I think what we center in our theaters in terms of the storytelling, right? So the centralization and the canonization of Shakespeare, of white Western classics, like all of that also needs to change and is changing. But, you know, the theater culture is also it's a colonial structure, right? In terms of the way our creative theaters are structured, which is here in the US, it's a specific 501c structure mandated by the government, but it creates a certain hierarchical way of being and institutionalization. And so I think the other thing that will have to change is that it's also not just keeping these institutions the same and saying in opening the doors of inclusivity, but it's also really assessing and tearing down these traditional models, right? What are what are flatter models of leadership, shared leadership models? What are, it's all of that really needs to be looked at. I think there has been a long push for buildings, right? Larger buildings buildings equate with prestige or quality, which is not at all the case. And our communities know that. But I think in the larger aspect, when folks look, they think, oh, I see this venue, it must be doing good theater because it has this, beautiful site theater space that it's using. So I think all of those things definitely along the way have to be looked at. And then I do think it's a leadership thing. I mean, no major theater in New York City is run by a person of color. Today, the top 5 theaters the top 5 by size, if you will, and budget in Southern California, all run by white males still. So I think it's going to be both a bottom-up thing, a grassroots thing, and then also a top-down thing. And I think the hard thing in all of that is our artists aspire to work at some of these other institutions because they also are trying to make a living, right? And so I think if there's greater equity, so if all of our organizations are able to pay at a different scale and to support our artists in a different way, it'll be interesting to see if they're still wanting to go to these other places, right? Because our cultures, our environment, our audiences are very different. And we hope that I think we all spend a lot of time hoping that they are inclusive in ways that some of these other places just have not been. It's also the thing of if you've been left out of some place or not included, suddenly when you open the doors, there's an expectation from these white theaters that will just show up because we haven't let you in, but now we've opened your doors and we're gonna, allow you to come through. But it doesn't mean, I think that's what they're seeing is that we're not waiting, right? We're not waiting at the door to be let in. We're going and creating our own structures and own things. And I think that's what is going to push ahead. I think all of our institutions are moving far ahead in terms of leadership, of the stories we're telling, the work, the artists we're uplifting, because we've made that front and center than, some of our kind of more well-known regional institutions.
Mm.
Yeah, I've been having a lot of conversations with my white colleagues in the theater, and they're asking the right questions, which is how do they make their company more equitable and more diverse? And when I suggest to them that they have to make a commitment to start to make a commitment that all of their productions have to have a 50% BIPOC artists for everything from this point forward, the first thing they say is, oh, I just don't think we're ready for that yet. Well, there's no middle step. You've got to make that, you have to make that commitment and work towards it. You can't say, well, we're going to commit to like 10%. You've got to commit to 50%. Maybe you'll get to 40%, but your aim is the 50%. And until you make that as the priority, as the mandate for your theater, you're never going to get there. So it's like I just feel like everybody's been doing it incrementally in the last 10 years, and we have to stop. If you really want to be as inclusive as possible, make a commitment and say we are moving forward from this point forward. We are having a 50% BIPOC artist both on stage and off stage, and that's how we're going to move forward. And then, figure out if you can make that happen. But you've got to aim there and not say, well, we're going to aim at 10% now, and then we're going to aim 15% in 2 years, and then in 3 years. Like, it's not going to happen that way.
Yeah, and can I just add that, like, having that 10% can actually do more harm, can cause more injury to those people that are the 10% representing all the BIPOC perspective. Kind of like what Leslie was saying, how like on Broadway it does more injury than good. So
that's right.
Yeah. But I mean, just to piggyback on that, the other thing is a lot of that work has been disingenuous. So the other thing is, if you don't want to do it, don't do it, right? Like, if you want to operate the way you want to, then that's fine. It's worse when you kind of go through the steps, but you're actually not committed. You don't want to hear, you don't want to change or listen. I also think there are, I think that's a part of it. A lot of the barriers to access have also been because in order to do this, there's an expectation of being unpaid or cheap labor for a long time, right? Like the way you get in is by working for $100 a week and things like that. And I think those are the ways that there isn't, there's a critical mass of students, and I do think the university programs are getting more and more diverse. It's then getting those students into the theaters. There's this leap that's needed, and I think that's where now we need to focus attention, because I think if those folks can get paid and properly supported, then I think that will definitely diversify the pool. But right now, class is also something that is a big issue that intersects with all of this that we don't talk about often in our field. And I think that is actually, class has become a bigger barrier to gaining experience and access.
I mean, that's so true. Whenever I first discovered how much some interns and production assistants get paid in arts institutions in America, I was very, very surprised. And also because from a socioeconomic demographic, like only certain people can afford to go and do those internships, because if they don't have the funds to support themselves in New York City while they're getting paid $100 a week, then it's just not possible for a huge amount of people. So that across the board is a massive issue. I think the other thing that is, from my perspective, and I'm on the outside looking in, as an Australian living in Hong Kong, watching this from happening in America, what a lot of stories left on the table if you're not including a diverse group of people in your company, right? Some of the people that come from diverse backgrounds have the most fascinating stories and art and history to share with the greater American community. And it does seem a shame to be not accessing or plugging into those stories. Would you agree?
Absolutely. A couple of things come to mind when I heard you say that. There's research now that folks who are on the margins are the most brilliant and highly creative, because we've had to continue to do all these workarounds. And guess who's been on the margins, right? The other thing I'll mention too is that, so if there's a question of our capability or hiring, we're brilliant. I'm just going to toot our horn here. We're brilliant. We've been working around. We're adaptable. And because of our backgrounds, we come with great traditions from our motherlands, even if we're generations away. And that's been our saving grace, is to hold on to who we are and our culture and traditions. And even against forced assimilation here in the U.S. and around the world, but especially in the U.S. context. So there's a real brilliance and an understanding about what stories need to be told, especially now. Your question about what stories are not getting told. Well, I actually want to bring that up, because I think this dovetails to what you were just saying, Anna. There's been stories told about us, but not with us, not for us, but kind of about us. But they've been the stereotypes, and because of the invisibility that Snehal and others have alluded to, it's been appropriated. So there's a way settler colonialism here. We have to speak to that. We can't not mention it. in any conversation anymore. We have to speak to how that genocidal warfare initially has replicated with forced enslavement here, which also has led to mass incarceration. I'm Japanese American, but how does that, in U.S. concentration camps during World War II? But today it replicates and replicates. And it would have the stories be told about us as foreigners as stereotypes, right? So we're getting now to, we've got to be the storytellers to actually reclaim history as it really was. We have to go with what the true history is. In fact, Yuri Kochiyama, dear activist and real mentor to so many of us during the civil rights movement, she worked with Malcolm X and the Black Power movement. And then generations later, she's mentored to a lot of us who are helping to bring this movement forward in the theater and the arts and culture sector in coalition with other social justice movements. She said, tell the true history, Leslie. Tell the true history. So it's our charge to lift up the stories of our artists, to tell their, like you said, our stories are brilliant. They're interesting. They're, multifaceted and so rich. But that's the real history. And that's part of our decolonizing process, is to support our artists to tell their stories. Yeah.
Anyone want to weigh in on storytelling in terms of representation?
Well, I think it's very important to really reach out to our BIPOC artists, especially writers, and nourishing them and really giving them room to write the stories, because I don't feel like the larger theaters are even really giving them the space to do that, or a space where they can fail. In smaller theaters like Playwrights Arena, East West Players is not a small company, but they have the space for those, where they also feel safe in writing those stories. And I think the more that we can give them the space to write, the more that the stories can be told. And I think one of the cornerstone of Playwrights Arena is really about reflecting the city, our stories in the city that we live in. And sometimes when I look at my other colleagues, predominantly white institutions, and I see their plays, and I'm like, who are they talking? Are they only reaching out to white people and not reaching out to the 50% of the city? Because I'm Filipino American, I'm sitting there, and it doesn't really reflect back to me or say anything to me. So I think we have been carrying the load for the longest time of making sure that the visibility is out there, and that we are presenting these artists, we are presenting these plays, and we are doing the work so that whatever the larger theaters, or even the small theaters who are predominantly white, are neglecting, that we are out there trying to get these writers out. And I think not only Asian American playwrights, but Black playwrights and Indigenous playwrights. I mean, I know Leslie works heavily with Indigenous Native American writers, and certainly at East West Asian American writers. And with Playwrights Arena, we are very diverse. So it could be, we work with Black writers and Latino writers and different, of different spectrum, of the spectrum of the color. And I know Jully, not only has she been working with these companies, but, with Cold Tofu, I mean, they have really been reflecting the Asian American culture through their work. And I think that's what those are the stories we're telling, and we are continuing to tell those stories. And I think, I wish that we are all getting the kind of money and support that we need to keep telling those stories, because we've been telling those stories with $5 every year, and we need, we need $5 million for the next 5 years to tell those stories. And that's where the inequality happens. You see larger theaters like CTG, just in the notion that maybe they can, promote something, they get a Doris Duke, grant, but for us who's really been doing that, we can't get, $10 out of that grant. And I think funders need to start thinking about how do we really help smaller theaters to tell these stories so that they can be elevated and we can really like bring these stories out.
Jully, tell us a little bit about Cold Tofu for those who don't know about the company.
Yeah, thank you, Anna. Cold Tofu is the nation's first and longest running Asian American improv company. We run workshops and do shows, primarily Asian American cast, primarily Asian American students. This past year during COVID, we've been able to get students from across the country, but several from Chicago. And what's been really cool is that improv is predominantly like a white male art form, generally speaking, since the 80s, which is actually why Cold Tofu was started. It was started by 4 women of color, 3 Japanese American, 1 Mexican American woman. That has always been in the DNA of the organization, representation, being authentic to yourself. And I can't tell you how many students come to Cold Tofu and say, I didn't even know this existed, because I've taken classes at UCB, Groundlings, and I've always been the only Asian person there. And it's hard to be creative and free if you feel alone, So and improv is so it's collaborative. You have to work together and you have to feel comfortable and safe. So I'm just glad that Cold Tofu can offer that. And there have been improv companies that are giving us the space. So talking about collaborations, we've kind of been not performing since COVID, right? We don't have our own Twitch channel or anything like that. We've been performing at Impro Theater. They've given Cold Tofu a space. Impro Theater is another big improvisational theater in Los Angeles. And a brand new theater company has come out, Outside In Theater. So these collaborations are really helping us thrive, where we're a safe space for Asian American performers, aspiring performers, and all performers, really. We just happen to be primarily Asian American. And these collaborations have been really helping us help the students as well. Yeah.
Oh, what a wonderful initiative. And also improvisation tends to be such a huge confidence builder, right? Even for young people to be on stage and thinking on your feet. I've always enjoyed watching it. I'm very bad at it myself because I'm a backstage person, which is another point, I think, too. There also, you all work in the creative industries, but it's not only on stage representation, it's people backstage too, lighting designers and scenic designers. And those things are still predominantly taken by white men, and it's been interesting because I've been doing some recruitment recently, and it is very interesting to me to see who applies, right? And sometimes we advertise big positions and things like that, and then all we get is white men applying for the job. And I had expressed to my colleague the other day just how disappointed that I hadn't seen any diversity in those applications. I hadn't even seen from a gender position, like women applying, and I expressed my disappointment, because how are we supposed to find these people if these people are not applying? So what's the pathway then for people who should be represented to get out there and get the courage to apply for these kind of positions? Because I know that some people, even like myself, I want to see those people. I don't know where they are. So how do we bridge that connection?
Reaching out, I think asking around, who do you know, who knows who? I think, you have a job, you go through your normal networks. Well, if that network has always been white, what makes you think suddenly other people are going to be even seeing these opportunities? And for people who have always been shut out, we don't even look in those avenues, because why would we? So it really takes that extra effort. But I'm sure like Leslie and John and Snehal could speak about this for days.
Well, I mean, I think for us, one of the things that we've been actively pursuing is going to universities and colleges around Los Angeles, and who are graduating as designers, and who are BIPOC that are graduating, and how we can uplift them and get them the start in, because unless they are completely like the genius that comes out of some school, they're not going to go to the taper right away. So most of us right here, right now, we are actually the place where where emerging artists, designers, backstage people are working. I mean, I've met so many of them through East West Players, and it's just because that's who are the people we're nurturing, and I think the more that we can find them and locate them and give them the place to grow, then we are creating it. And I also know for a fact, I think Leslie or Snehal has the information that there is a list of there is a database of designers, BIPOC designers that people can go into, and it's a national list, but there is such a list that exists.
So what you're really saying is about that pipeline, right? Because like you said, if they don't have the confidence to apply for that high level position, we've got to start way back when they're coming out of university and give them those opportunities so that they're right there in their late 30s, ready to do one of the biggest shows in the world or whatever that they're trying to apply for.
Yeah.
Snehal, I'm sure you've got thoughts on that.
Yeah, I mean, I think the other thing that is what everyone was saying is there's two things. One, I would say the journey and the narrative, the journey of Asian Americans into theater and art, like, we know that the stereotype is that all our families wanted us to be doctors, lawyers, engineers, right? And business people. And so many of the folks in our field have found their way in after another career, right? Like they found their way in different ways. And I think, I don't know for all of you, but I never thought of a career as a director or artistic director. I got into theater as an actor. And then along the way, I was like, oh, I'm really bad at this, but there's other things I'm really more interested in. And I also don't want to be on stage every night. So I think, but you have to be in the theaters to find those different positions. The thing that I keep thinking about is this wonderful program that Leslie led, that my predecessor, Tim Dang, did on his last show, where we invited homeless youth from the LGBT Center to basically be apprentice at East West Players. And they came and worked in a variety of capacities, from box office to house management to design. And I remember one of the youth didn't know that, that you could have a career being a costume designer, but not only that, but you make your way in because you can be a design assistant. And so the sewing skills he had, you know what I mean, could lead to a career, but he just didn't know that those were possibilities. We only see what's in front, on stage, or you have like ideas of, oh, I can just be a designer for clothing lines. That there's other career paths is what we also need to continually expose our youth to. And I think that sometimes runs into a barrier in our homes. But it's also, more and more arts funding keeps getting cut. Students are not coming to being brought to the theater or having access to the arts. So that's going to continue the inequity. But Leslie, I don't know if you want to say anything else about that program, but I think those are what we need. Yeah.
I still keep in touch with those, what I say apprentices, because they were really working and learning on the job. And that was a tremendous experience. But that said, it actually speaks to your question, Anna. I think it's the job of the institution or the organization that is putting the posting out. First of all, you have to look at the language of your posting. We know now, in fact, when we give workshops on this around equity, diversity, inclusion, and justice, you have to look at your language. Is the language truly inclusive? Does it have ableist language? Is it somewhat homophobic? And sometimes these biases are in there and we don't even know it, right? We have to really interrogate our own language. Then we have to look at our bias, and we have to look at, are they supposed to just come to us because we threw up an ad? This is the same with our theater audiences. If we throw up a sexy ad and we think they're supposed to come, no, we actually have to put it upon ourselves now to go out and make relationships. And we have to build those networks by going there and saying, what is this? Who is this community? How can we support you? How do we come to be of service first? Not that you're going to come and get something from us. That's an old, very predominantly white institution kind of way of thinking. We will come because our communities run very relationally. And we get like this, it feels like white supremacist culture when it gets too transactional. Then we think, well, that's not a place for us anyway. So we have to shift our cultures in our orgs. If we want to see change, we have to change. And change will only happen as fast as the individuals are willing to be anti-racist and anti-homophobia, anti-Black, we have to abolish all those oppressions, and we have to work on that ourselves. And you'd be surprised how folks are more open to us to actually have that relationship. And then we'll look and act more welcoming, truly. And then folks will come and apply. But that relationship building is critical. The other thing I'll say on this is, this was a very interesting and controversial conversation, pipelines, a number of years ago with actually the Lord Theater organization in this country. And they had a conference. They were at our national conference, and it was a very, everyone attended because I think it was like a plenary. And they were talking about the pipelines, building the pipelines so that folks could have more access who are marginalized. And then a person of a marginalized group stood up and said, I've been in the pipelines and I'm perpetually in the pipeline. Done with pipelines. Done. So we have to really look at, what do we mean by pipeline? Because you can just say you need to be an assistant again. You need to still be an intern over here before you are really able and or deemed ready to have the position or to move forward in your career development. So we've been working to disrupt that idea of pipelines for some time. It's got a lot of work to do still, but I think that initial conversation did a lot to get people rethinking. I think about shared leadership. We have apprentices come. Now we're going to move someone to being a stage manager, not make them be an assistant again. When someone assistant directs me, eventually they co-direct with me and then they will direct. So we change their title. We change the experience so that they're more and more empowered to act with agency. And that's part of that shared leadership model that Snehal was talking about. That's creating real equity.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Oh, no, I think that's I think what you said was quite significant to me, Leslie, because I think the onus is that the issue is out there, right? Not in here.
That's right.
And for us to understand our own culture, for us to understand your culture, we first need to understand our culture, right? Because if we understand our biases or our own internal wiring, then we can see you in a more clearer way, And I think that's the mapping of what we need to do, say if we are the white hirers or the white directors or whatever, is to, as John was saying, not 10%, 50% change our own mentality of, okay, well, yes, this is going to be more work, but we're trying to open up that network of wherever those lists are, which I'm going to contact you all for after this, by the way, and start to build those foundations that change that culture and that shift.
Yeah, and remember, relationships are not one-off. Like, because you put a posting out and you want to outreach and build some networks to recruit people differently, right? And really welcome them. Even after they interview, are you going to keep a relationship?
Yeah.
After you go to another organization like LGBTQ Center in LA, I still have contact with them. I still look after what's happening there so that I can still remain open to those relationships. And I'm in Alaska. I might have a candidate that would like to come and work up here. So these are not transactional. We have to look more long-term at relationship building and allow that to change us. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. A question from Albert is, could the panelists speak to theatre boards and their influence, and how effective can they be to initiate change? Anyone got a response for that, Snehal?
Yeah, I think they can be hugely impactful, and I think access to getting, because, again, in the model that's set up here, the boards are kind of the ones at the top. They have the responsibility of the organization. They do the hiring of at least the top report to them. And then they can hold that institutional leader accountable. And so I think they are hugely important in this. And I think the first thing needs to change in terms of the access to those boards, right? Those boards have traditionally been exclusionary because it's pay to play. You have to donate a certain amount and then you can join the board. And so I think those barriers have to first change. And I think as the boards diversify, that will lend itself a lot to the organization itself changing. And so, yeah, I think that's a huge part of it. Here is one thing, though, that is very, very interesting right now, is that as these other institutions start to change and to adapt, right? So as our PWI, predominantly white institutions, seek to diversify their boards, they oftentimes don't know where to look. So where will they look? Hey, they will look at the East-West Players Board, or the Playwrights Arena Board, or the Perseverance Board. And then they will seek to poach board members or donors from our institutions to join theirs. And it's one of those things where that happens in the field, and that is, but what it is there's one East-West Players and there's 90 predominantly white theaters in Los Angeles. So you could you could not only gut us as an organization, but you could also, you create so much work for us in another way, because now we're having to have all these other conversations, and the folks who are on our board and our donors are committed to us. So it's not, but it's just this thing of, they just are in their own silos, and we're going to make change, and they don't think of a larger ecosystem that we are in, and that there is one of all of our organizations and many of all of theirs in these cities. And they just come with a number of resources. So I think that's one thing that I have seen, that with their good intentions of change, they're still really disrupting and affecting culturally specific institutions, because the Black theater companies are experiencing the Latino theater companies, the Native ones, in the same way. And so now I really ask folks at these other institutions to, you know, to think of the impact as they diversify their boards on our organizations, because most times it means coming into reaching out to members of our community. So I think that that's Al is a wonderful member of the East-West Players Board, and for full transparency. But I think that is so key. I think your board should be a microcosm of the community you wish to serve. It should be a microcosm of your audience and your artistic community. I also think, when possible, having artists on the board is also key.
Oh, no, that's very interesting. Anyone else want to weigh in on the board?
Yeah, Anna, what you're speaking to too is, and even with the pipelines and hiring and all those things, because boards ultimately, like you said, Snehal, hire the leaders especially, is structural change. Are we willing to change the structures of our organization so they're not so transactional, they're not white supremacist culture? And there are articles about that, so you can have a checklist about what is a white supremacist culture. And you can just look at all those points and go, oh, and they give you some, Tema Okun gives you all these pointers about how to shift that, how to change that culture. So what I'm saying isn't necessarily have to be a mystery. There's lots of great information out there now. But we're talking about structural change. That's where I think theater is absolutely a change-making industry. We actually are leaders in this, because we know now that when our young people come to us and they get summer theater, or they come for a program, we have arts education, we've taught them about team building, we've taught them about the power of creativity and imagination and problem solving. And they, whether they stay with us or not, we hope they might, but they take out with them, especially if we give them equity, diversity, inclusion, and justice context as well. They go out into other sectors. We know that those who have had impact or experience with the arts in other sectors have had a very positive experience, usually, where it has enriched their lives, but it's also given them really tangible skills that we don't talk about enough. And we're getting better at sharing our narrative and our impact that way. So we've impacted society greatly, more than most know. And as we change our structures so that greater creativity and the brilliance of our humanity can really sing truly, we're actually change makers for all of society. Yeah. And our boards really getting in alignment with that is powerful. Yeah.
I think when you come from it, the theatre can be either a reflection of culture or it can drive culture, right? So if we're putting, you know, the most influential time when you're a child. And if you go to see shows that, I mean, what got me into the arts was the profound shows that I saw as a child, right? So, and if on those stages you are seeing that diversity and those stories that are going to awaken you, then that grows up to be the norm as opposed to whatever is prior to that. So before we finish, this has been a wonderful conversation, so thank you. Before we finish, I think a lot of individuals are here watching, so I kind of want to just go do a little bit of a roundtable and say, from an individual perspective, be you BIPOC or no, what's one takeaway or one action item could we take away today to say to improve the situation? Is there something that we could think about, action on, pick up tomorrow and do that we could help and support the situation?
Well, something that I'm taking away is what Leslie had just said about, she said, you can Google it. There are tons of articles about finding ways to, you know, decolonize and de-white supremacy structure our organizations, and seeing those like actual actionable items that you can take in a checklist of, do we do that? Do we do that? And just further interrogating our own biases as well as our organizations. Thank you, Leslie.
Snehal, you were about to say something, but I think your microphone was off.
Yes, I'm sorry about it, but I think the other thing just to always keep top of mind, particularly with boards, is that budgets are where you show your values as an organization, right? Ultimately, the money is what will show what you value, and boards are the ones that approve it. You know, the artistic leader creates it. But if you value artists at the center of your institution, the budget should reflect that. I just think that is where, again, there is a place to look on paper to see, is your organization, walking the walk, right? They say one thing, but then are they doing, is their actions and the money in alignment with that? Is the one thing. And then the other thing is, now is actually the time for change. I think we have had a crazy 18 months, right, of the pandemic, of all the racial unrest, of, we just are barely, a year out of the Trump administration. So I think the other thing is, now is the time for change. And as we are on our way to reopen and before we reopen. And I think the thing that will combat that is a high nostalgia factor for the way things were, because folks want comfortable and familiar. And I think I think a lot of institutions are wanting to go in that direction. But the thing is, we can open a brand new world. If we do it now, it's going to be much harder once we are fully reopened and going again to make these shifts. Now is the time to make giant seismic shifts, and folks will come, you know what I mean? And folks will accept and embrace them, because everything about our lives and societies has changed because of this pandemic. But if we don't do that stuff now and we go back to where we were, then I think, again, we're in this cycle that we have to combat. But yes, it's also, as Jully said, it's incumbent on everyone to Google it themselves. That is, right, the least you can do, because that will lead to a wellspring of change.
Wonderful.
I think for me, my last thought would be just to be aware and really know your community, where you are, who are the people around you, and are you representing those people? Because I think, if what your programming doesn't match in your community, wherever you are in Los Angeles specifically, then you're not doing the work. You're not doing the work. You're just doing some kind of work that is not responding to what is what is around you. So I think, I would encourage everybody to just keep looking and being aware of their community and where they are. And I don't care if you're in Beverly Hills, there is going to be another group of people that you are not representing. And I think you need to figure out how you're going to do that and how you can engage them into your community, into your theater.
Wonderful. And Leslie?
Well, I have a checklist for everybody.
Good. Hit us.
First of all, acknowledge the land upon which you're set, the indigenous peoples. And like John, to to your point, learn the history upon which all of this is built right where you are in your community. That's huge. And be good stewards of that land and work in concert with the indigenous peoples of that land. And then I would say along those lines, yeah, learn the history, learn the true history, the indigenous people's history. There's many books now, but I would also start, to your point, Snehal, about classism. I would start with the book called Caste, C-A-S-T-E by Isabel Wilkerson. And it's a great overview of the classism and even transnationally. And in that book, it actually talked about how we now in the U.S. have a culture that does not foster empathy, or we wouldn't be having the racial reckoning we're having now. So read that and begin to foster real empathy. Really, truly put yourself in the shoes of folks who have been marginalized and try to understand. That book is a great tool toward that. And the last thing I will say is nothing about us without us. And I've added, and when creating solutions, include us. So nothing about us without us. And when creating solutions, include us. Yeah.
That is a wonderful message, and also a wonderful theme to leave you on, because I think that's something we can remember in our minds. So, ladies and gentlemen, what a wonderful conversation. I just really appreciate spending an hour with you guys today and you imparting your wisdom and advice on our larger, greater community, a theatrical community here at TheatreArtLife. And just quickly, I think, what's the best, quickest, fastest way for people who might want to ask any further questions to find you? Is there a way to find you on LinkedIn? What's the process?
Oh, yeah, LinkedIn is great. Or you can contact me at Perseverance Theater. Yeah.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
And
they can reach me at playwrightsarena.org. There is an email thing in there that they can send.
Wonderful. And Snehal?
I think artistic director at eastwestplayers.org or on our website. There's contact info.
Perfect. And Jully?
coldtofuimprov@gmail.com.
Perfect. Great. Well, thank you so much, everyone. I really appreciated this time with you. And thank you to our audience for showing up today. And yes, we'll be in touch.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Leslie, Snehal, John, thank you so much for the conversation.
Great seeing everybody.
Thank you.
Have a great evening.
Thanks so much. Thanks to Raphael, too.
Yes.
Yeah. Bye for now.